and is a level 3 coach, I believe, level 3 BC coach, and yeah, is currently very active in the combination of what we do as sports scientists and what coaches do, which is certainly something of great interest to me as an applied researcher. Professor Andy Lane is currently at the University of Wolverhampton, formerly worked at Brunel, did lots of studies at Brunel, PhD at Brunel, yeah.
Did them all at Brunel, actually.
Did everything at Brunel. Andy is a BASIS accredited practitioner, chartered scientist, works with English Institute of Sport. So Andy has published extensively in the area of sports psychology, but also does a lot of work in applying that research and that theory to the real world. So has worked with the English Institute of Sport, has done quite a lot of work with boxers, I believe, and plenty of work with cyclists as well, and that's what we'll be hearing about today. And Andy's presentation will be a very interactive affair where he talks you through some theory and shows you how he applies that theory as well. So first of all, I'll hand over to Andy. We will try and keep to time as best we possibly can, so we're hoping to conclude the session at about, well, on the hour, but we'll try and give everyone the opportunity for some questions at the end as well. Okay?
Thanks, Simon. Right, I thought it was a really nice lead into the session this afternoon, our previous session, with Mikkel and Dirk. They brought out some really key messages for me. One that came from Mikkel on looking at different aspects of performance was pedagogy. So, how people learn. So, the original, can't hear if I move. I like to move about as well. So the original title of the symposium was The Dichotomy Between Sports Science and Coaching. So what I mean by that is that we all, I'm assuming everyone's involved in sport here, we've all got the same aim: to enhance the performance of the athletes that we work with, or to give the people we work with a good experience in and through sport. What, from a coaching perspective, a question I've asked throughout the weekend, we've had some excellent presenters. The key question I've been asking though, on a lot of the research is, so what? What does this mean to me as a coach, as an applied practitioner, and what problem does your research solve for me, and how can that be delivered in a way that we can influence the behaviour, I'm not saying the performance, the behaviour of the athletes we work with. Now, we have physiological adaptation with training, obviously, that's what we're looking to train. However, unless we're able to impart knowledge or to develop individuals, then the likelihood of them reaching their true potential isn't there. So, use an example yesterday, and I'll be very careful because we had an excellent debate between Dr. Mark Burnley and Professor Sam Marcora. Now, for me, I think Sam came out on top for me. I'm going to pin my colours to the mast. Sam came out on top of me, because he reinforced my beliefs. So he said that talking about the relationship between performance and RPE, so it's dependent between the physiological systems in the mind, saying that the first thing that was published on that was in 1885. So that was the beginning of the journey. He was wrong there. That wasn't the first thing that was published in that area. Plato published it several thousand years before Christ on it, that the body and mind, and if we want to go a bit further, maybe like the endurance runner Scott Jurek talks about soul as well, everything, the whole system needs to be trained together. So Sam came out on top for me because I understood what he was talking about. I didn't understand these mechanisms he's going, and he didn't convince me because the pedagogical side, the way he expressed these arguments, weren't relevant to me as a coach. Now, for lots of people in the audience, they would have been highly relevant to them if they had that depth of understanding. I couldn't transmit what he said into my practice as a coach, though. Similarly, I've got Dirk looking at me, and as one of our partners at British Cycling, it's one of my favourite relationships, but I'm quite nervous, Dirk, because what is it? You're the chief evangelist, so I'm trying to live up to that for British Cycling, trying to be, well, a little Indian evangelist. But the impact Dirk and his company have had on cycling throughout the world has been really, really massive, simply because they present a product in a relatively simple way that hits bits of the market. So whether you're a beginner or an expert, there's things within the product that you can use and apply within your context, and it's, for me, easy to understand. So it's absolutely key as practitioners that the focus is always on the rider or on the client. So it's about understanding who our client is. I did a straw poll on a lecture at University of Teesside earlier in the year, and I asked the question, how many people believe in the saying, treat people in the way that you want to be treated yourself? Straw poll, 95% of the hands went up. And I'm standing there and said, bollocks. Treat people the way that they want to be treated. So if I'm in an audience, sitting there like you, staring down here at Andy or whatever, I want the presenter to be speaking in a language that I can understand. If we've got an hour's presentation and I take one thing out of it that really stands out and go away and learn from that, that's a success. I'm going to ask, how many people have read Steve Peters' book, Chimp Management Paradox? A few? Why I think Steve's been so successful at British Cycling is that he's taken some really, really complex neurophysiology and presented it using a little chimpanzee, and talks about recognising your inner chimp. That all resonates with us. We've all got our own inner chimp, that little irrational thing that gets carried away with emotion or whatever. So that's my segue into what Andy does. I contacted Andy actually last week because we had the other presenters couldn't make it. And the intention of inviting Andy is that I know him to be a fine applied psychologist. Now, I went to a workshop that Andy did on the EROS project, looking at emotion regulation in sport a number of years ago. And I got one of the nicest comments ever from Andy, saying that you're a physiologist in a room full of psychologists, and you've said so much more than any of these people in the room. He did say that. But the key thing with Andy is that he's an applied practitioner, he's a psychologist, but wider than that as well. He writes for Runner's World, works with, heavily involved in parkrun, so the 5Ks that tens of thousands of people do up and down the country every Saturday, me included. I love doing them, and Dirk, you would get on well there, because I call it the Church of Parkrun, because everyone's a wee bit funny. They walk about and it's like, if any of you ever go to church, it's that sort of family that you would see in a church, and it's the Church of Parkrun, I call it. So Andy's a high priest of Parkrun, I think. But what he does is work and influence the behaviour of mums who go along in their oversized t-shirt to cover their bums because they're embarrassed and things like that. And he influences them. He makes their life better. So I'm going to hand you over to Andy. He's going to take you through some applied practice, what he did with the BBC, and then we're going to have a bit of an interactive session with a young athlete here. Not an Olympic athlete, Chris. It's not a Marco Pinotti. But how many of us in this room work with Marco Pinottis? Or athletes of that level? There'll be some of us. But for the majority of our careers, we'll be dealing with Joe second cat, Joe third cat, or the mammal who can spare a couple of £100 a month to pay people. These are our typical clients as well. So I'm going to hand you over to Andy now. I'm going to shut up, and Andy.
Okay, thank you very much. Chris Fullerton as well is joining me on this. What Andy didn't say is that he contacted me. I was still on holiday in Spain, and then what he then didn't realise is that we turned up last Tuesday to fly back from Spain, and is that we got sent back from an airstrike in France. So I got back on Saturday from Spain, 5 days late. Just to add a little bit of a twist to that, we left our daughter at home alone. We watched. She's seen Home Alone twice, so she was fully prepared. She's 17, but it was a little bit of a risk for that, and we didn't really catch up about the content of this until Tuesday morning. And on Tuesday, we're going to a cycling World Congress of Cycling. There's sort of one little bit that we just thought we'd add a little bit of interest to that. So Chris and I rode here from Lichfield, or so we intended. It's only 104 miles, and Chris had a Garmin to navigate us through. He had 1 day to learn how to use, because he lent it to our colleague Tracy Devonport, who did Land's End John O'Groats with her family to raise money for charity for cancer. So it was 3 punches and a broken gear changer later, but we got to Sheffield at 85 miles at 8 o'clock at night, and we got the train here. So we've done a bit of
You never told me that.
The flexibility in your goals is important, because to ride 85 miles, I know we haven't ridden here, but still seeing that success is fairly important. Understanding what that was a positive experience as we rode through the English countryside. He kept going off a bit, little legs going up the hill, my old legs going up slowly behind him. My wife told him as he left to look after her husband, and when he turned right at the top of Long Line, there was nowhere to be seen. So we've had 2 or 3 days here. We've caught up with the literature, we've done some practice going into it. What we're talking about in this session will be some research and practice in sports psychology, applying that to cycling. I've done quite a bit of work in cycling, lots of work as runners. Interested in one of the sort of major bits of cycling, I worked for a youth development cycling group in London in the late 90s. And what is quite nice from that is when I looked back at the files I had from those riders, and there's some really fabulous riders who have emerged out from that to be world, Olympic, and success in the Tour de France. And you can look at that data of that as a 14-year-old, and you can think those conversations you had with that, because you've distinguished them from the other. So it's reflecting on those experiences. As I was rode up, I was thinking about how that could be built in. But that was some 17 years ago. So there's quite a bit of time has gone on in putting into this. This is a shameful plug on the book that Greg White, Rich Godfrey and I have just done. We started off this with a publishing company, and then we published it ourselves. It's 30 case studies in this, with about 2,000 words each, with a commentary of about 500 words. I think 6 of our keynotes are commentary on this. So it's available at Amazon. It's really quite an easy book to get. So it's that. I shall leave it there. And if you want to go and read it, that's Andy's copy. So if you want to, he will maintain.
Pay a tenner for it as well.
Well, it's only £9.19. Well, I mean, it's right. It's there's no profit in that at all. So what we're doing, we're looking at rider data. How a rider might use scientific data to help training and performance. That's a sort of kind of an obvious one, but I think it's quite important to just to look at that. We did a lab-based study, which I think is quite useful, which is an approach to using research to gain insight into the mind of a rider and then apply that back to the real world. And we'll take anecdotal reviews and anecdotal data on how we might use this in training, which is largely what we do anyway in training. I saw the presentation this morning as data is fired up. There are beliefs about what the causes of lots of things, and it's okay to explore those, but we can try and be a little bit more systematic about how we do that. In terms of some of the work, which I've barely recognised the introduction, and this is guiding the way I've been working over the last few years. We did this project which was funded by the Research Council, called Emotion Regulation of Others and Self, and what came out of that near the end as we worked with the BBC Lab UK, and this was in terms of research and practice, a fabulous experience. That we ran an online project which Michael Johnson fronted, where people did a test, which was a performance test, to do something as fast as possible, which was find numbers in a complicated grid. And then we gave them interventions. So we gave them an intervention called if-then planning, which is about identifying a problem and having a solution there, so that when the problem presents itself, the solution is conscious in your mind, so that if you're not going to use a solution, you have to ignore it, and it's really simple to do it. Self-talk, we talked about that, and we heard about that yesterday, how self-talk can improve performance. So we built that into the program. We took some complexity about that. So we had self-talk when it's very motivational, come on, you can do this, that sort of thing. Self-talk when it's very instructional, think about the specifics of the skill. Self-talk about beating a certain outcome, and self-talk about beating a previous performance. So sort of quite the interplay across that, and then visualization. And we did that across all the three things. One of the things about this was to set this up as a self-regulatory project, so that people could go back and re-look at it, redo it, and the idea that these are the sorts of things that people use anyway. So we weren't as much giving people new things, but looking to fine-tune what they've already got. As people do anything, they start learning ways to doing it better, and part of they'll be talking to themselves. There'll be an emotional response. There'll be a reaction to that emotional response. Given to this, if I got very nervous for this talk, if I got very noticeable of my nerves and became paralysed by those nerves, then that would be a very negative thing, and that's not a very good thing for me to say, actually. A very negative thing to happen in terms of then being in a situation where you have to think very clearly, as a simple overview of how emotions can affect performance. And we will be seeing this at the World Cup a little bit more, where penalty shootouts will force the control of emotions and its effect on behaviour in a very clear way, where people fail to be able to deliver a very overlearned skill to do that. And we should see some of that in the Tour de France. So what we'll do is the first sort of one of the issues we have in performance and sport is the idea that is not very good. I'm going to let that come up, because that's the study we're going to be looking at. I'm just going to knock the sound off. So the video that's the video of us piloting the study. It's going on. Just when you're going to do any work with an athlete or any research, it has some sort of real world value. So unpacking the thoughts and feelings that what going on in any performance is quite a useful way of doing it. Sort of anecdotal approach would be to ask someone, or how do you, use questionnaires as your means to gather that data. That's okay, but I mean, for anyone who's used questionnaires, so someone asks you how happy you are, you put a 4 down. What is the value of a 4? It's all a bit arbitrary, a bit vague. To make any decisions in terms of interventions, if using self-report, you are really on sort of I think, a fluffy variable. So what we try to do is try to take some of the theories and some of the ideas of the idea of how to make someone go better, set up research designs so that we can test that and see those variables unfold in the lab, and then develop interventions around that. So what we did in this study, which is unfolding, is we were interested in 10-mile time trial performance. So from a cyclist perspective, from a researcher's perspective, we were interested in the extent to which emotional invasions usurp your performance. So as you're going along, if you're behind schedule, does the anger that kicks in have a negative effect? Do you start interpreting fatigue in a different way when you think you're behind that schedule? And we know that happens in races, and we know that when people go into races, their perception of how well they're doing can be made relatively early on. And we know also, and we saw this beautifully with the Training Peaks data and the use of we've got heart rate monitors, Garmin speed. You pass the 2-mile mark, you'll look down at the speedo. If you're behind goal, there'll be one response. If you're ahead of goal, there'll be another response. That makes total sense. One of the things we've done with Chris, and Chris's PhD looks at that, which is self-control, is that how do people regain self-control when they get some really negative information that comes back? And the idea that it can absolutely wreck performance. So what we did in this study, and it's just seeing one rider going through it now, is we did a study where we got athletes to ride in 4 conditions. One of those conditions was just ride with all the feedback. So they've set their goal to do a 10-mile, reasonably good riders. What you've got is my brother there. He was the angry rider, but we agreed to be videoed. One way is full feedback, so you can see where you're going on, measure emotional responses ongoing, the whole shebang of lactate and heart rate, ventilatory, and you can see all the stuff attached to them. So we've got the full physiology data, we've got the power data going in, so we can look at all that later. The athlete can see that as it's going on, trying to maintain the watts to a certain value and so on. Yeah, normal scene stuff you'd expect. Then we blinded it so that they had no feedback whatsoever. So the idea that you're in a race, but you don't know where you are, you don't know how far you've gone other than your internal sensations. And then the next one is we manipulated the feedback, so we covered everything up, and every mile we gave them feedback saying you've done it in this time, so therefore you're ahead of schedule because we got their goal, and that was one positive thing. So in essence we lied to them positively. But of course they don't know we're being lied to them. They have joined up into this study with the basis that we're looking at pacing. They've filled a whole load of questionnaires out on pacing. We've done all the sort of stuff we do as on an intervention. So the emotions you feel prior to a race, emotions you feel during a race, all self-reports. So they've got this emotional package. Prime them for being aware of their emotions. Prime them to the scales we're going to be asking during the test, so that they are familiar with what's coming. And then the fourth case was all about then giving negative feedback. So you're behind schedule, and that mirrors what goes on organically to many people in many races. Yeah? The sort of the emotional. The emotional invasion of feeling that this is absolutely pointless to work really hard when you're behind your goal is what many people experience. So in terms of the applied value, that's in essence where we're setting out to test. He's really giving it some there. The nice part about this study, and the nice part about doing anything with cyclists, is that they absolutely bury themselves in lab-based studies, and the physiology data you get from riders is really good in that we've got lactate scores, which I'm sure you understand, or very familiar with, over 6, 7, really high scores. The idea that they took this as a joke was not in response to the lactate scores, which said they're in agony, in my mind. And as you saw me have a go at this. One of the reasons I have a go at these things is because we were lying to them, and the person who's lying to them was the physiologist, and the person who was lying to them had to be convincing. And so I did all 4 tests, and I had to try and guess which test was which, and obviously the blind one was the blind one. But I had to try and work out the feedback, which way round the feedback was, and it was very difficult to do. So once they demonstrated that, but the real world value of that is that was just what's going on if you've got data. You would look at your data going into something, and it's not quite what you'd expect. As an athlete, Chris, how does that resonate with your experiences?
Yeah, sometimes you really to a competition, coaches might try to motivate you in a session, and perhaps not always give you the feedback that you want. To try and get might just be a second or so, but a split time. Try to get a little bit more out of yourself, and depending on how you're doing in that session, whether it's early on or later on, and how hard you think it's going to be to achieve that goal, will influence how much sort of effort I'm likely to put in at the end of a session, whether I want to persevere with it, try and get something out of it, or certainly with the time trial, whether I want to save my efforts for the following week and think, okay, I'll change my pacing strategy, perhaps go out harder earlier on in the race, and approach it differently like that.
I mean, almost the common thing for most of us in races of any importance is to go out too hard. To go out too hard, possibly then get ahead of the goal and get the positive, but then watch that gain drift off. Then
yeah, and it's sometimes, certainly with the Garmins and whatnot, sometimes not always that completely accurate anyway. You might turn up to a roundabout, you've taken a slightly different course, and you might actually approach around, might be 10 seconds ahead of the schedule. I've had that certainly in cycling races. You look back at the file, you've done this 10-mile cycling time trial, but your Garmin file says you've done 10.14 miles, for example, and so you actually a false sense that you're ahead of schedule and you're ahead of a PB, and you look back and say you get an earlier time check than you planned.
I mean, and this data, which we just very briefly, the positive and negative feedback. This was published in I think a year or so ago. There was no difference in watts across the 2 conditions. It's not statistical, but in actual numbers it's about 3. And the average is different, about 3. It's remarkably similar. It's one way you look at it and you go, that's wrong. So we checked it and rechecked it. It looks like, I mean, the obvious difference is the negative one, where we kick in at 1 mile, where we've told them that they're lying. They try harder, so they'll put more watts in the negative feedback early on, and what is the consequence of that is that they're not going to sustain it. So they're behind the goal and push and push and push. The goal, I mean, one of the interesting things we're going to be putting out to is that the idea that the goal has to be a time or has to be a position, and that how fixed that is in the athlete's mind, and how that creates the response of, here we've got an increase in watts, we've got the clearly less happy, that's fairly obvious, it's fairly obvious it's going to go on. So they're less happy, they feel less energetic, they feel more downhearted. This all absolute makes sense, what we'd expect. They get anxious, goes up. Then we get to some of the interesting. We get no real difference in the heart rate. We get a big shift up in lactate, simply because they've bunged in. They've put in a lot more effort. Their confidence to control their emotions deteriorates, so it comes out of their control, and the amount of effort it takes to change their emotion goes up. So, in other words, the cost here is remarkably different for the same performance. So it feels harder, they're unhappier, they're trying harder to regulate their inner states, and they're trying harder to regulate performance. There is a clear difference in the amount of oxygen used when oxygen uptake in the 2 different conditions. In other words, take the positive one. If suggests there's headroom to move up, it's the same person. They can go into. They certainly can exercise at that higher level in the negative one, suggesting that they could use more the different physiological state going on in that performance. And the glucose going up, they had a theory of which Chris talked about yesterday in his presentation, that glucose is meant to be used in self-control and you have to work harder, meant to go down. We got the idea that positive feedback liberated, created more energy. And I mean, there is a bit of an argument that getting the right emotional state gives you the sense of feeling more energetic. That suggests that more energy came into the system as it came in. The unpacking the sort of behavioural response a bit more is where we had negative feedback and unpleasant emotions. We get these spikes in power, and it's obvious as a coach would say, well, what's happening is as the negative feedback comes in, we have a surge, and that's exactly what we've got. Every time they got given the feedback, we get this surge in power, or this effort to try and get back into where they're going. So the pacing strategy in the unpleasant, when you're behind the goal, gets erratic, whereas the pacing strategy when you're believing you're ahead of the goal is more consistent. Remembering that there's absolutely no difference whatsoever between the two performances in actual performance. One feels hard, it's unpleasant emotions, there's a physically more demanding, but it's the same performance. Remarkable in that sense, but in reality, what you can have, in races, people can report absolutely dreadful races based on that type of information, that interpretation of that feedback, and the route to that, based on what we've got here, is there evaluation of the ongoing goals. So what we do is we how this lot relates very nicely to oh no, hello. Oh.
Andy, while you're doing that, can I ask you a question?
You can.
So we had Professor Marcora talking about, and Chris as well, because your PhD is related, talking about RPE.
Okay,
let's look at
sorry.
imagery, and let's look at that for use in running.
That wasn't what I wanted to put on.
One of the great benefits
and now,
of imagery is using it as a strategy to...
I've got myself all tangled.
Question that runners often ask. What can I do when my legs are burning, when everything else is saying to slow down?
Sorry about this.
Imagery is a great technique to use in such situations. Because what it helps you do is it focus on good technique. And by focusing on good technique, you start being able to cover the ground more effectively, and also doing it.
Bingo.
Yeah, so Professor Marcora was talking about RPE. So what the suggestion is with the positive feedback, that RPE is lower. So the suggestion may be that in a challenging situation, then there's greater capacity for appropriate decision making. Would that be
well, it would, in essence, that would be somewhere around that. The decision making. What you've got going on there is that people are unhappy with their response to that information. So they're in essence trying harder. I don't know about I mean, the interesting bit about Sam's stuff yesterday and the game is looking at where that, Sam talked about brain training, and you looked at the playing this brain training game, or you could look at where such brain training occurs naturally, which would be not too dissimilar to what Chris and I did on our cycle ride. Is you have to concentrate quite hard riding on new roads for a long period of time, or you have to drive somewhere new. So if you spend 3 hours driving somewhere new, looking at roads, if you not so much, I mean, sat nav has taken a lot of the stress out because it tells you where to go. In the good old days when we had no sat nav, you remember driving with a map on the side, desperately looking at roads. You came out feeling fairly tired. In essence, what the brain training game does is simulate that process of trying to do something else and then adding on to something extra. I mean, not Chris can want to talk about this a bit more, but the idea that repeated acts of having to control your thought and emotion to do one thing ultimately wears you down. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, I agree with that. And with the having in theory, have a greater capacity to make more decisions. You sort of perhaps the choice between lots of decisions is reduced when you're perhaps perceiving it as unpleasant. Whereas you've got more resources available, perhaps in the positive state at that. Whereas an athlete would have in the negative. Say being negative, experience negative emotions, would have to find from somewhere more resources that perhaps immediately don't present themselves as being available. So, say high RPE, for example, there's going to be fewer resources available, and the athlete's going to have to train, or perhaps whether it's motivation, find some additional resources from somewhere. But obviously, there's the argument that the body generates enough energy in times of high priority. So if it is meaningful in the time trial, for example, at the end, and consistently athlete perceives that it is achievable, then the body can generate enough energy to support that, even though, say, in a negative condition, which perhaps explains why actual performance is quite similar, even though the route to getting that performance is different.
So our study looked about the negative thoughts and feelings that come from being in relation where you are to a goal. Right? What I've done is these are some scenarios we've set up on. It's related to running, but it actually makes no difference because it can equally relate to cycling just as well. It's how you then react to some of these scenarios, and what this will do is we can discuss it in relation to our own experiences, and these are the ones in I would say. These are the ones I prepared earlier. So we set out some negativities. Some of the planning that you can do in work then with athletes is work through these scenarios. If someone passes you, what's going to be the emotional response to being passed?
Slowing down. Well, the likelihood that I'm going to achieve my goal is harder. Where it's reduced, and that person's overtaken me. They can obviously leave me. I'm useless. I'm going to give up.
I mean, you've got someone passes you. There could be the response to being passed: annoyed, make a decision to catch them back. I mean, Chris did a marathon last year with a goal to was it trying to get, you wanted to get 2:40.
Yeah.
And it set out, but he'd be setting out at the sharp end of the Abingdon Marathon, where you could easily get into a 2:35 group, and you could then easily get carried away by someone going off and just chipping a few slightly too quick miles, and someone then breaks that group. What you're looking at in that respect is the self-control to draw that down, isn't it? So it could be someone passing you. One response would be to go with them. One other response would be to remember the goal of sticking to the plan. But in the race, the remembering the goal can be quite difficult, because the emotional response kicks in immediately as someone comes in as to follow them. We had a club run once and Chris came and did the club run, and it was not that well marked out. Sorry about this. And he went and he flew off at the start, and of course he didn't quite know where to go. I mean, it's a classic of a self-control issue of how you put anyone in a competitive situation, even park run, which is in essence a fun run. And I remember doing this on a park run on Christmas Day a few years ago, and I said, "We're just jogging round, aren't we?" And they said, "Oh yeah, yeah." Just jogging. I said, "It's Christmas Day. We're just jogging round," and everyone bolted off, and it was the difference in time between that and the previous week was none. I thought, yeah, I mean, as a Kent, where you put people into a race and they act in a race type situation. The scenarios there, this is just built into the video, this will then save me from saying it to you. We'll quickly go through that. I'm not going to...
This could be really negative. You could start saying negative things to yourself. You start feeling angry, which is
I sounded a bit like Bruce Forsyth in that one. In essence, you can get into these series of negativity, and the research would say, and we get the nice observation of that is that it produces marked physiological responses. What we get into from this, and we're sort of moving to the end of it, is in my mind the idea that we equip athletes with flexible goals, and the idea that having a position, a time is all well and good, but that's somewhat out of your control. So you're going into a race where the goal is to do so and such as a time trial, but you don't really know the wind conditions, you don't really know the weather conditions, you don't really know the course, you don't really know the terrain, you can go faster on smoother roads, and so all those things chuck in. If you have a fixed goal that makes you feel quite negative, you can get behind that, and you get the physiological response that kicks in, that comes with that. Your underperformance by your own inner story has really been affected by that. The switch, and what we've worked with Chris and with others, is to help with people with process type goals. So in cycling, one of the big cycling and in running is the idea that your focus would be on delivering performance as fast as possible, and that is then focused on what you're doing. So the classic for a cyclist is using imagery, and imaging steam train wheels, the image of a steam train wheel. So whenever it gets difficult, is to kick into using that imagery of steam train wheels, and that just turning round, so you're just imaging that as it turns round. And the idea is that you spin that round at the speed you want your feet to be cycling, and your feet sink into the image that you've got going. Rather than the time, rather than the position, is you then control the inner story in terms of what you're doing. In running, we have images of very good runners, and ask people to think of images which relate very closely to the skill, and then practice those in training so that they get quite good at them. And then we build that into their memory using if-then planning. Do you want to tell me if-then plan? Do a quick if-then plan?
Andy, I'm afraid you have to.
Oh no, sorry. I'm sorry. I've overdone it, haven't I? And I've overdone the questions. Yeah.
Well, I think we probably have chance for perhaps one question, if someone would like to ask Andy or Chris a question before we close the session. No? Okay, right. Well,
Thank you.
Andy, thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
Andy,
everyone.
thank you, Chris.
The